Chapter 8 A Terrible Story. "What do you think is wrong with him?" said Annie. "I don't know," said Jack. He put the wallet in his bag. "But so far, immersion's been a disaster." "Well, we can't give up now," said Annie. "Come on, let's follow him." As Jack and Annie started after Charles, the street was quiet and empty. It seemed the blinding fog and damp drizzle had driven everyone inside. They hadn't gone far before Charles looked back and saw them. "Don't follow me, children," he called. "Please, I want to be alone now. I must be alone." Jack and Annie watched Charles vanish into the mist. "Maybe we should go back," said Jack. "We could find our way to his house and wait for him there." "Something tells me he's not going home soon," said Annie. "I feel like he really needs our help now." Jack sighed. "Yeah, I feel that way too," he said. "So let's follow him, but we'd better keep a safe distance from him so he doesn't see us." As Jack and Annie followed Charles through the fog, they could hear the tapping of his walking stick on the cobblestones. They followed the sound down a sloping street lined with shacks. In the dingy light of the gas street lamps, Jack could see garbage in the gutters, cabbage leaves, moldy bread, rotten fish. The poor neighborhood frightened him, but he and Annie kept going, following the sounds of Charles' footsteps and the tapping of his walking stick. Then the sound stopped. "Wait," Jack whispered. Jack and Annie froze. They couldn't see Charles through the fog, but they could hear the sound of sobbing. "Oh, no," whispered Annie. Jack and Annie moved closer to the sound. Charles was sitting under a street lamp at the bottom of the hill. His head was resting in the crook of his arm. "Charles?" said Annie. She stepped closer to Charles. "Are you okay?" Annie sat on the curb next to him. Jack sat on the other side of Charles. "You want to talk about it?" he asked. Charles lifted his head. "I'm sorry, I've never told anyone this before," he said. "Not even my wife or my closest friends." "You can tell us," said Jack. Charles looked at Jack, then at Annie. He stood in motion for them to join him. Then he pointed into the fog. "Over there, near the river, was once a shoe polish factory. It was a tumble-down old building filled with river rats. I went to work there when I was 12. I sat at a table, pasting labels onto pots of black polish. I worked 11 hours a day, 6 days a week, yet I barely earned enough to keep alive." "You were only 12?" said Jack. "Yes, and I lived alone. I had lost everything, my family, my school, my dignity," said Charles. "Were you an orphan?" asked Annie. "No, I had parents," said Charles. "Why did they make you work in such a bad place?" asked Jack. "My father had fallen on hard times," said Charles. "He was a good man, but he couldn't pay his bills, so he was sent to a debtor's prison across the river. My mother chose to live there with him." "That's a terrible story," said Annie. "Wait a minute," said Jack. "You mean your dad was sent to prison because he couldn't pay his bills?" "Yes," said Charles. "That doesn't make sense," said Jack. "How could he earn the money to pay his bills if he was in prison?" "It's a very good question," said Charles. "That doesn't happen any more," said Jack, thinking of life back in Frog Creek. "Oh, yes it does," said Charles. "Life is still miserable for thousands of poor. Parents live in prisons and workhouses, while countless children work in factories and mines for pennies." "But at least things are different for you now," said Annie. "You're a famous writer. That should make you feel better." "How can that make me feel better?" said Charles. "What is writing? Just ink on a page? It's not food for the hungry. It's not medicine for the sick. Lately I've been thinking I should give up my writing altogether." "Oh, no," said Jack. "You can't do that." "It seems so foolish and vain," said Charles. "But," said Jack. "No," said Charles. He let out a shuddering sigh. "I've decided I shall write no more." "Charles, what about—" said Annie. "Be kind, children, and leave me now," said Charles. "I need to be alone. My heart dies inside of me." "Oh, okay," said Annie. She and Jack stood up. Bye, Charles. Jack started to wish Charles good luck, but the words stuck in his throat. There was really nothing to say. As Charles covered his face in despair, Jack and Annie started back up the hill. Can't just leave him, said Jack. I know, so let's stay nearby, said Annie. Jack and Annie found a stoop to sit on, and they watched over the lonely figure at the bottom of the hill. Now I know why Merlin sent us here, said Jack, but this really seems hopeless. Look at our research book, said Annie. Maybe it can help us. Jack pulled out their book and looked up Charles Dickens again. He read aloud, Charles Dickens was born in England in 1812. He is one of the most famous writers of all time. He wrote many novels, including Oliver Twist, A Christmas Carol, and... Wait, said Annie. A Christmas Carol? Wasn't that the name of the play we saw last year with Mom and Dad and Grandma? Yeah, said Jack, on Christmas Eve. Oh, man, that's why the name Charles Dickens sounded familiar. Look, there's a picture of Scrooge, the mean guy in the play, said Annie. She pointed to the picture in the book. It showed an old man wearing a nightcap and holding a candle. Jack read the caption underneath. A Christmas Carol has been retold again and again in plays, movies, and television shows. To this day, it inspires people to be kinder and more generous to others. Wow, remember the 3 ghosts who visit Mr. Scrooge? Said Jack. The ghost of Christmas past, the ghost of Christmas present, and the ghost of Christmas future. Right, they try to change him by showing him his past, his present, and his future, said Annie. At the end of the story, he's like a different person. I can't believe Charles wrote that story. Well, now it seems like he won't, said Jack. He just said he'd never write again. He said his heart has ached. Annie stood up and brushed herself off. So get out the violin and the bow, she said matter-of-factly. Oh, I forgot all about our magic violin, said Jack. Me too, until now, said Annie. Get it out. I'll make up a song. What kind of song? Asked Jack. I'll make up my own version of A Christmas Carol, said Annie. But it won't be a story about Scrooge. It'll be a story about Charles. A ghost story about Charles Dickens.